Hey everyone, this is Caroline with Fiveable. Thanks for tuning in on this lovely Wednesday. Tonight we'll be talking about population ecology. Super exciting jumping into ecology. Last kind of major topic that we'll cover before doing a heck of a lot of review before the AP exam, obviously, which is going to be here before we know it. So if I pull up a calendar really quick, so hopefully you guys know, May 13th is the big day. So besides this session, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sessions. Yeah, 8 sessions before the AP exam, which is really crazy. We have 9 full weeks before then, but spring break is one of those. So you'll be enjoying yourself somewhere else probably and not listening to me talk. So it's right around the corner. Hopefully you guys are getting ready, gearing up and excited. I know my students are getting ready right now as well. And don't you worry because we'll have lots of review leading up to exam time. All right. So as always, Fiveable Plus is our extended membership. It is $25 if you join now. That will be going up closer to the AP exam, and you have early access to slides. You have access to my slides, period, extra help, study guides, etc., closer to the AP exam. Definitely a worthwhile investment. All right, let's get started. Okay, so ecology is, in my mind, the easiest AP topic, although some of my students would definitely disagree with that. So, I'll definitely go through everything that you need. But to me, this is pretty basic. As long as you can read a graph, and critically think, you are good to go for ecology. Okay, so today I'm going to go through kind of a basic overview of ecology as a whole. Most people have a pretty good understanding, and the nice thing about AP with ecology is it's not that much more complex than maybe the ecology that you studied when you were a freshman or took an intro bio class. So students tend to do pretty well with this. Quick overview, and then we'll talk a little bit more about population ecology. And do some practice math problems. So as always, I suggest that you have some sort of writing utensil / piece of paper with you. Tonight it would be helpful if you had a calculator nearby or your phone to use as a calculator so that we can get through some practice problems. Okay. Oh, you know what? Give me half a second. I'm sorry. I want to actually pull this up. Sorry, everybody. Pull this up as a PowerPoint because then I can write in it. So give me just half a second. If we were in class right now, I'd say talk quietly amongst yourselves. But oh no, what just happened? All right, give me a second. This is just like a classic Caroline moment where technology has rebelled against me. Everything is bad. I'll entertain you by talking about, we're going to learn about abiotic and biotic factors. And right now, the abiotic factors in Chicago are still unbearable. It's still incredible. I think it's like 20 degrees outside right now. And I truly don't think I can take another day of being this cold. I feel like I need to, my bones are actually just absolutely frozen to their core. Okay. Sorry about the delay. Again, we're doing math. I forgot for a hot second that I want my PowerPoint up so that I can write. Hopefully this works. One time it was really, really annoying and just wasn't switching on your end. So I'll make sure that it's going through and have you guys back up. Okay. Thanks for listening to the ramblings of my brain. Here we go. Okay. Ooh. Screen's up. So far, so good. You just make sure your screen changes because the first time I did this, we had a problem. No, your screen didn't change. What in the heck? I don't understand why PowerPoint screen sharing doesn't work. Okay. Well, the world is deciding to hate me today, and we're going back to Google Classroom. Maybe someone, not Google Classroom, Google Slides. Maybe someone who's smarter than I am can figure that out for me. Until then, what is ecology? And I will just pull up a separate program for for drawing on things. Hopefully you guys can figure that out as well. Okay, as we were. So what is ecology? So ecology is like a really broad word for just describing the study of relationships between organisms and between organisms and their environment. So when we're talking about ecology, we're talking about relationships between living and non-living things. We're talking about relationships between living things of the same species, living things of different species, basically all sorts of relationships between organisms and the world that we live in. And there's a beautiful picture of that right there. So levels of ecology. So we'll spend 3 kind of weeks in total talking about ecology. So this week, we're obviously doing an intro to ecology. We're also going to talk about population ecology. And a population is defined as a group of the same species living in the same area. So humans in Chicago is an example of a population. Humans in Illinois, humans in the United States, humans in the world. I can share a really cool link with you of the world. It's called, what is it called? The World Population Clock. And you can see how fast our world is increasing. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So that's population ecology. That's going to be our major focus for this week. So we're going to do some math problems and just look at how populations can grow and et cetera, digest that a little bit. Then next week, we'll talk more about community ecology. So a community is a group of different species living in the same area. So the humans, bacteria, rats, and pigeons living in Chicago would be a community. Same area, different groups of species interacting. The savanna would be a community, like where we could talk about all the different animals and plants that are interacting with one another in a community. Ecosystem then is going to include the actual physical environment. So you can see in this picture, we have like water and a beach and mountains that are making up this ecosystem. And that will definitely play a role into the way that we look at like a biome or something like that. And then we have our biosphere, which is the entire Earth. And so we'll talk more about like the biosphere and ecosystems in our third week, because we're going to talk a lot about human impact. Surprise, humans are ruining everything, and the biosphere is definitely one of those things. And so we'll chat about it. For sure. And the human impact is really important, not just because you need to know that humans are destroying the planet, but also because they oftentimes will throw in problems like this because it is such a current event, talking about global warming, things like that. They often include things like that on the AP exam because they really like to include things that are current and big in the news at the time. So there's always going to be one long free response. Usually it's a long free response on something that's more of like a current event situation. So it's always good to talk about the human impact. Okay, so some important vocabulary. So this does not all have to do with population ecology, but ecology as a whole that you should be familiar with before we get started. So you very well may have talked about these things before, but biotic versus abiotic factors are really important. So if you had to learn like Greek or Latin root words, this would be a good time to bring those out. So bio, hopefully you know bio means life. So bio is literally life. You can tell your bio teacher. That's what bio means. And then A, if you put A or anti in front of something, it means the opposite of. So it's going to have the inverse effect. So biotic factors are any living factor in an environment, and abiotic factors would be any non-living part of an environment. And you can see lots of examples here. So fungi, plants, protists, animals, archaea, bacteria, anything like that would be a biotic factor, whereas like temperature, weather, air, salinity, light, water, pH, humidity, soil, minerals, climate, rocks, anything like that, mountains are going to be abiotic factors. This doesn't usually, like I've never seen this on an AP exam, but my students always like to think about like a wooden table. Technically, biotic factors are anything that is living or has lived. So dead or decaying things are still biotic factors. So wood or a log or a wooden table or something like that would still be considered a biotic factor because it has lived. Then students like ask about paper and clothing and things like that. And the short answer to a longer question is that there are biotic factors in paper and in a lot of clothing, but they're oftentimes mixed with a lot of abiotic chemicals and things like that that are not naturally occurring and have never lived. So just some important vocab because we'll definitely talk about those interactions. Oops, I thought I had one more. Okay. a little bit. Okay, no worries. So when we're talking about populations and population changes, because that's going to be our focus of tonight, we're really going to talk about, again, groups of the same species living in the same area and how they can be affected by change. So when I talk about this with my students, we'll focus in on a population. Like one example would be a population of elephants living in Africa that has overgrown its environment, right? So this population is greatly increasing, and they're destroying their ecosystem and the other things in the ecosystem because they're overgrowing their environment. And the kind of question is, what do we do about that? So these are the kind of questions that ecologists ask themselves all the time when they're studying populations. How is this population growing? Is it healthy growth? Why is it growing? Why is it not growing? And they kind of have to be like expert fact finders and investigators in order to figure out the different factors that are affecting a population at any given time. But really anything that you can think of that would affect a population, like temperature or predators or food supply, or truly anything that you can think of, is going to boil down to a contribution to one of the following four things. Those four things are births and immigration, which would add numbers to our population. Obviously, things being born increases the numbers of the population. That's a big one. Immigration, things moving into this area. So maybe here's Suzanne the bird, and she has 2 little babies, very exciting. So she's adding to the little population that's living on this nice little stick and this nice little tree in this nice little forest. She calls 2 of her friends and she's like, you guys got to get over here. This is the opportunity of a lifetime. I have a great branch for you. Okay, so 2 of her friends fly in. They're like, oh, yeah, this is a great place to raise a family, right? So those are ways that we can increase our population. But on the flip side, population can decrease. Hawk flies in, eats a bird. Hawks are apex predators. They're going to be at the top of our food chain. We'll talk more about food chains and things like that next week. So there can obviously be death, which will eliminate members of the population. And then maybe forget the name that I gave the bird, Suzanne's friends are like, this is not a nice place to raise a family. And they decide that they actually want to leave over here, and that would be emigration with an E. Well, you can tell immigration and emigration apart. So immigration is adding numbers into a population. So I think it begins with an I for in, things are coming in. Emigration begins with an E for exit, because things are exiting the population. Okay, so no matter what factor that you can think of, whether it's biotic or abiotic, whether it's like a disease coming through or a food shortage or whatever it may be, or removing predators from an environment, removing predators will certainly increase the number of organisms in a population, but it's increasing them by decreasing the number of deaths, if that makes sense. It's kind of like a double negative. If you decrease predators, you're decreasing the number of deaths, which in turn would potentially increase the numbers that you have in your population. So that's what this boils down to. So we can determine change in a population at a very basic level just by adding up the number of births and immigration and subtracting the number of deaths and emigration. So I'm going to show you really quick before we jump into a bunch of problems. Population collapse. Because this is like a nice little depiction, and I'll have you guys click into this and kind of take a look, and I can show you some of the important factors that go along with this. So this is through the US Census Department. And if you open up the population clock, you can actually see in real time the predicted population of the world and of the United States, which is really, really crazy. Because it's increasing pretty rapidly. So if you click into this, you'll notice that the number on the right, that 7.56 billion people that our world currently has on it, is increasing incredibly rapidly. In fact, I think when I was looking at this earlier today, I mean, we were probably like at least 40,000 people less than we are right now. So you'll notice that number is absolutely flying in increasing. And so our population as a whole in the world, we have a lot more births than we do deaths. As far as the United States goes, we have about 1 birth every 8 seconds. And it's not like someone's here clicking and adding every single birth, death, et cetera, as the birth and death certificates come in. But if you think about it, it's actually pretty easy to estimate the average rate of increase because we have birth certificates and death certificates, and therefore they can compile all of those and then extrapolate and come up with kind of the average birth rate and death rate for the country at any given time. And then they add in also international migrants, or people who are coming into our country. So because we have one birth every 8 seconds, one death every 11 seconds, and one international migrant coming in every 34 seconds, we have a net gain of 1 person every 18 seconds in the United States, which is pretty crazy. Okay, so they're calculating the same thing that I just showed you on that slide. So number of births minus number of deaths, plus people who are coming in minus anyone who is leaving, and they come up with this calculation, and therefore you can see our population slowly increasing by 1 person every 18 seconds, which is obviously vastly different from what you see on the right. And you can see also, interestingly enough, we're the 3rd most populated country at 331 million people, which is actually not totally accurate if you look at the US population on the left-hand side. But both India and China are 4 times as large as us. And so we have this huge increase in population in those countries in particular. If you scroll down on your webpage, you'll notice that there's some interesting statistics about the US population by age and sex. So these diagrams are relatively important. It shows you the health of a population. So if you're looking at that, the United States population by age, I guess I can share this screen with you, yeah? I don't know what I'm doing. I know, Bailey, it's so cool. I'm like addicted to looking at this clock. I sent the link to all my students because they wanted to show their families. It's super interesting. So let me pull up my own screen because that was dumb that I wasn't sharing that with you already. So this is a really interesting graphic, and we're not going to actually talk about this too much, but it's an important aspect of ecology, so you should be familiar with it. So you can determine the health of a population and how fast it's growing by looking at this kind of breakdown where you can see the percentage of the population at each age, right? So if you guys are like 16 or 17 years old, there's actually more males than females in the United States who are 16 and 17 years old. So let's say you're 17, 0.67% of the population are 17-year-old males, and 0.64% of the population are 17-year-old females. And then you'll see we kind of have a bulge up here between like 26 and 27-year-olds. And then up here, these are like our baby boomers. So in their late 50s and early 60s. If you've heard of the baby boomers before, you can see that here. So one thing that I'll point out on this graph as you're looking at it, because this is an important thing to be able to pick up, and they do come on the AP exam sometimes, is that this graph is relatively like thick. Like it's not bottom heavy, it's not top heavy. It's kind of just like straight all through. And that shows like a net neutral population. And you do need to, again, kind of be able to interpret that on your own. And the best way to think about this is if we have the same amount of young people as older people, that our young people are going to go up and then replace the older people as they die, but not like we have a ton of young people that are coming up and going to take the spot of the older generation, which is why in the United States, we have like kind of a net growth of 0. We have a pretty slow growing country. So if you think about it, in order for our country to stay where it's at, everyone would have to get married and everyone would have to have 2 kids in order to replace the married couple. So when these 2 die, these 2 take their place, et cetera, forever. We know this is certainly not the case in America. A lot of people don't get married. A lot of people don't have kids or don't have 2 kids. Some people have more than 2 kids. It's very variant, but it all equals out to about an even kind of steady maintenance of our population. So we're not really increasing very quickly or decreasing for that matter. Now, if you look at some countries in Europe and you look at their graph that looks like this, they actually have a bulge of older people. And you can kind of see that here as well. We actually have less young people between the ages of like 1 and 7 than we do older people between like 52 and 65, which is interesting. So we are seeing a slight decline in the population. Some countries in Europe, you'll actually notice a bulge in the older generation and a tapering at the bottom, which means there are less young people to go ahead and replace those people who are on the top of the pyramid after they pass away. So those groups would have a population that's in decline. Then if you look at like some countries in Africa, they actually have a massive bulge down in like the 0 to 8 range. And then it tapers off very drastically. And they have very few people over the age of 50. And that's because there's a lot of early death and infant mortality and child mortality over in Africa due to various diseases and the lack of vaccination and solid health care. And so their population, while it would be growing very quickly, actually isn't growing as quickly. Because their children are not making it into adulthood. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea. This graphic is a really important one to be familiar with. And you should be able to kind of analyze this graph and be like, oh, okay, this population would be increasing, decreasing, or staying the same. And again, I could have told you none of that, and you could have used your logical brain to figure that out by looking at the different ages of various people in a population. So that's why I love ecology so much, because if you think hard enough, you can figure out the answer, which is not true for a lot of other topics. But it's good to hear about because you'll spend a lot less time stressing about it if you've heard about it before. Cool, so that's an important graphic. You can see growth by region. So the South is growing the most quickly of all regions. The Northeast is growing the most slowly, which probably makes sense. You can see populations then by state and city, et cetera. So it's pretty interesting. It's estimated monthly, right, by collecting birth and death certificates, but pretty interesting data. So again, just one way that ecologists are studying populations, and we're going to be doing some math problems with a human population coming up here. So it's kind of interesting to see what's happening in real time. And that link is there, and you can share. You can show your teacher if they're not familiar, because it's pretty cool. Okay, back to your scheduled programming. Switch over. All right, so that's, again, how the United States is determining the percentage of our population, or the change of our population: births, immigration, deaths, emigration. Okay, so with that, there are some variables that you need to be familiar with, because we're going to do some math, as I said, some variables and some equations that you need to be familiar with. So we have a population growth equation, just really basic, the change in growth. And so if you're not in calculus or haven't taken calculus, this demarcation dn dt, that's a derivative. The way that you can think about it in this class, and don't tell your calculus teacher if you're in calculus right now, because they'll probably be angry with me, but we can just think of that as like a delta n and a delta t. So change in population. So if n is population size, then dn dt would be change in population over change in time. And that's fine for the purposes of AP Bio. You do not need to be familiar with derivatives, thank goodness. Okay. So we're going to practice with some of these equations, and I actually have a few other practice problems as well that we'll kind of take a look at that I want you to be familiar with. But again, this is straight cut and pasted from your AP Biology equation sheet. Are you guys familiar with that, the AP Biology equation sheet? Because you definitely should be. Is anyone not familiar with the AP Biology equation sheet that you get on the AP exam? I'll post the link just in case. AP Biology formula sheets. Just so that you can orient yourself to the format. Like, I have a bunch of these laminated in my classroom so that my students can practice with them, just so that you know exactly where to look for everything when it's game time. So whenever my computer decides to load this, I will copy and paste this in so that you can just take a quick perusal. So this is exactly what you'll get in your free response and your multiple choice as your first 2 pages. So it gives you like your chi-square table. It gives you laws of probability. It gives you your Hardy-Weinberg equations, standard error of the mean and standard deviation. And then on the second page, you'll see all of our rate and growth problems and these variables, water potential, which hardly ever shows up. I never really even teach it. And then like your basic equations that you would need to know, like the volume of a sphere and stuff, which again, I don't know that I've ever seen that come up on a grid in, but I suppose it could. Okay. All right. So there's the equation sheet for you, just so you know where I got this information. And again, you should just be familiar with it for the future anyway. And with that, I'm going to look at a couple practice problems. But before we do, you'll notice here that we have 2 different equations based on having either exponential or logistic growth. And so we'll take a look at what that means in a second. So if you're familiar with exponential equations or an exponential graph, then the graph on the left should look highly familiar to you, because you can notice that this is, growing as like an x squared function would, and it's the growth rate of the population accelerating over time. So this type of growth would happen if we have absolutely no restrictions on us. And so if you can think of like a situation like a newly growing colony of bacteria would be experiencing exponential growth. And actually, if you were here when I was talking about the bacterial transformation lab, we actually try to like capitalize on this region of growth, this exponential growth, in order to get bacteria kind of at their prime when they're unrestricted by anything else. So on the right-hand side, this is going to be a much more common situation. You'll notice we have a red dotted line across the top, and that is indicative of the carrying capacity of an environment. So the carrying capacity is exactly what it sounds like. So a capacity is the maximum number of people. Like your classrooms have a capacity, your school has a capacity, a concert venue has a capacity, right? And the carrying capacity is basically how many organisms an environment can support given the factors that exist there. So since we have like 14 people, I would love for people to just maybe type something into the chat box, just things that they think would be limiting factors that an environment might not have enough of in order for a population to not have exponential growth and instead have some sort of restricted growth. So what are some aspects of an environment that would actually limit the amount of growth that we would see for a population? So I'll give, yeah, food sources, disease, perfect, lack of food, good, keep going. This is great. What else do we have up here? Competition, for sure. Can anyone think of any others? Predators, destruction of habitat. Holla tomorrow, what's that? Oh, hola, I get it. I was like, what are you talking about? Is this something else? Okay, perfect. Well, those are all really great, really great ways that populations can be limited. So you have to have enough space, right? You have to have enough water. You have to have enough food. You have to have enough oxygen, which is a weird one to think about. But if you think about it, if you're like in like my worst nightmare, like a closed off box with no access to the outside environment and oxygen, you would eventually run out and you can die, of course. So all of those things mentioned can definitely become, can create a carrying capacity of an environment. And the environment can also change too, right? Like if we're killing or, you know, knocking down a football field's length of trees in the Amazon rainforest every hour or every minute, we're certainly destroying the carrying capacity of that environment because we're getting rid of the shelter that exists there. So that carrying capacity can change, but we have this like rate of accelerated growth, and we hit like some sort of maximum growth, and then our population will start to slow down as they're kind of having their births and deaths due to any number of factors: lack of food, lack of resources, lack of water, lack of habitat, lack of whatever. They're going to start, that rate is going to start to slow down and taper until we meet the carrying capacity of the environment. We're going to see that in a practice problem in just a second. Okay, so some relatively easy math here, but then it's going to get ever so slightly more complicated. Okay, so our first question, I'm actually going to have you guys read through and take like truly 30 seconds to think about. While you're doing that, I'm going to pull up the program that I can use to write on so that you guys can actually see what I am talking about. Sorry guys, my website conked out earlier and now, oh, I got it. Phew. Thank goodness. Sorry that took so long. Anyway, it went away and then I couldn't remember the name of it. One of those classic situations. Okay, so hopefully this one was really, really easy. So we have 500 flamingos found in a particular wetland at the beginning of the year. During that year, 80 flamingos are hatched and survive and 50 die. If you go back to our equation list, right, we're looking for population growth. We have births rate, we have death rate, okay? So what is the population growth rate for that year? Show your work and units. Okay, so you should have found that we have a positive 30 individuals per year. So it's important to include a couple things here. So obviously 30 because we have 80 born minus 50 dying, so that gets us at 30. Growth rate for that year, so that's going to be individuals, right? Because that's specific number of flamingos, and then per year because that's the time frame that we're given. Because this is a rate, you have to have per like something over time. So this is individuals over time, which indicates that our population is growing by 30 individuals a year, which is not really, really quick, but it's definitely growing. It's not like it's declining or anything like that. So that's going to be your easy answer to that question. Okay, so we're going to use this same situation now into something a little bit more complex. So now I want us to find the R max for that year, which is the per capita growth rate and what this indicates about our population. So R max, if we go back, is relatively easy to find. And so we're actually going to assume for the initial time being that we're in exponential growth. Okay, so our change in population equals R max times our population size. So I'm going to flip over really quick. I'm going to do a lot of flipping here. Sorry, y'all. Bear with me. This is like my worst nightmare of technology, by the way. It's because my darn PowerPoint wouldn't work. Okay, hopefully you see what I see. Perfect. Okay, so back to our equation that we're going to use. We have, we're assuming exponential growth, so our change in population over our change in time is equal to this new variable R max, which is our growth rate, times our population size, which is n. Okay, so we already found our change in population size, right? We found that that was going to be equal to 30. Move this really quick. Okay, so we found delta n over delta t. I'm going to write delta n for the sake of you not having to look at me write terrible things with my handwriting. Is equal to 30. We have n, our starting population of flamingos, equal to 500. Whoop. Perfect. So then we have 30 equals R max times 500. And by this time, you probably all have had an answer for 5 minutes now because you're watching me painfully write this entire problem out without a mouse. I really need to invest in a mouse, right? That's definitely the move. Right, so this is simple math, and you should get that R max is equal to, anyone get it? Anyone have a calculator? Type it into the box. It's more fun if you say it than me. Anyone? Come on. 30 divided by 500. Okay, I'll say it because you are saying it. R max is equal to 0.06. Okay, so with this number, what these kind of mean, just for reference, right? You can think about this. So however much we're growing, we can be anywhere between basically 0 and I would say 1 would be an extreme, but I guess you could be higher than 1. So because we're looking at the change, right, if we have 0 individuals coming in and 0 individuals leaving, then we would have 0 divided by your population, and our R max would be equal to 0 because we're not growing. Okay, I love that they tell me I've done good work here when it's like the worst thing you've ever seen. If our population is doubling, right, and we had 500 individuals and we're adding 500 individuals, and we would have 500 is equal to 500 R max, we would have an R max value of 1. So if a population is doubling, your R max value will be 1. If a population is not growing at all, your R max value will be 0. And again, that's not something that you need to memorize because you can just plug numbers into this formula and think about it logically and see what that means about the population. So because we're very, very close to 0, we would say that this population is growing relatively slowly. And it's important to be able to kind of come up with those solutions on your own because you may be asked to read something or, think about something like that in the AP exam, okay? So I'm gonna jump back because apparently that's what I'm doing today. It's just hopping around. And we're going to try a little slightly more complex version of this problem. But hopefully so far you're like, wow, these problems are really easy. And the answer is yes, they are really easy. So these are the kinds of things that you want to like pray for in your grid-in sections of your free response. It's all simple algebra. So as long as you can apply an equation, and honestly, like I could teach you none of this and you should still be able to apply it, although it's way better if someone's talked about it to you before. But these are really, really easy points. If you think about some of the paragraph long text questions that you can get in the multiple choice section, these points are practically free. Okay, we're going to take a look then at the change in this population over 5 years then, given the Rmax value that we have. Okay, so if we consider this population to be an exponential growth, let me copy this into, will this work? Stay tuned, I'm not sure. No, darn it. Nothing wants to work for me today. Nothing to paste. Shoot, okay, it's fine. We can just write this in here. So sometimes you might be given, in any given AP problem, you might be given a chart like this, and you'll have to chart the population growth over like a 5-year time span, which is what that chart was. So I'll show you what that would look like, just so you're familiar. Okay, so for your reference, right, we had our calculations in the middle, our math calculations. I'll do it all swirly because it's easier for me to write. We have our years for time. And then we have our results of our population. Ooh. Hey-oh, this is like really pretty cursive. Wow, you guys are lucky. You probably have no idea that says result. But that's what it says. Okay, during our first year, right, we have a population that ends at 500 for our flamingos. Okay. Okay. So then, given our growth rate, we can apply this year after year. So we can do our year 2, year 3, year 4, and year 5. So if you had to predict like 5-year growth, you can go through and do this using the formula: change in population over time is going to be equal to Rmax times n. Okay. We already kind of calculated backwards here. So this calculation is going to be really easy for us because the change in population is going to be equal to Rmax, which we already discovered is 0.06, okay, times 500, which is going to give us 30, right? And we can add that to our population. And our new starting population at the end of year 2 is 530 flamingos. Because why not? Flamingos are fun, okay? All right. Next, so year 3, now we have different n values. We have delta n still. We have 0.06 still because we're considering to be an exponential growth. 0.06, right? Times 530. We're going to get a slightly different answer here because we're not multiplying by 500. We're multiplying by 530. So if you're following along with the calculator, and again, you've probably filled out for all 5 years by now because this is so slow for me to write this way. We get 31.8, which we'll just round up. Sometimes you can keep the decimals, but for now we'll round to the nearest whole flamingo. Okay, so that we would have 562 flamingos. Okay, and you can see how this is increasing steadily. Okay, so the next one, our change is going to be 0.06 times, I'm not going to rewrite it because you know how slow this is for me. So 0.06 still times 562. 33.7, so we're going to round up to 34 flamingos. So 34 plus 562, 596 flamingos. Wow, this population's really taking off. And you can see we're increasing more and more each round, and that's exponential growth, right? That's what you would expect. We're steadily increasing, okay? So now we have 0.06 times 592. Not 592, 596. I'm sorry, I must have been looking above. And we have 596 times 0.06, and we get 36, an increase of 36, which is going to give us a population 596 of 632 flamingos by the end of year 5. Okay, makes sense? Again, this is exponential growth, which is why we use this formula. We were not given a carrying capacity, so we can just assume that this is exponential Yeah, 0.06. Thank you. Perfect for answering that. All right, wonderful. So I'm actually going to hop then, instead of going through the practices that I was going to actually look at, instead, let's take a look. Well, sorry, I'm going all over the place with my train of thought. We'll pop back into the presentation. Yeah, that should be fine. If we have time at the end, I'll show you one that with a carrying capacity. That's what I was just kind of reading. I think I'm going to skip the next couple practice problems because they're pretty straightforward and it's hard for me to write on that thing. But you can obviously look through them in your own time. And then it's about a population in Los Angeles, very small population. But at the end, I'll show you what it looks like when we have carrying capacity involved in a problem like that, because we're not going to see exponential growth then. Okay, so take a look really quick at just a few graphs here between a wolf and an elk population. So a couple of things to point out here is that oftentimes when you see graphs of like a predator-prey relationship, like a wolf and elk relationship, we have different axes for our predators and our prey, because usually there are a lot more prey than predators. So you'll notice that here, like our wolf scale is 5 to 20. Our elk population is like 20 to 120. So there's a lot more elk than wolves, which makes sense because the higher we move up the food chain, the less organisms live there, or the less organisms exist there. Okay, so that's just something to point out because our eyes naturally want to read the axis to the left-hand side here. And so students oftentimes will get those problems wrong when, again, you really just needed to be able to read a graph. Okay, so I'm going to show you a few practice problems here because I wanted to go through a few practice multiple choice and then a few practice of those math problems with you, just to become familiar with these and to also show you that you can really logic your way through ecology and be just fine. A lot of times teachers leave it till the very end in case they run out of time, just because students can get their way through it. So calculate the change in population of wolves from 2001 to 2003. So these could be like a grid-in question, or you could actually see multiple choice like this, and they would just give you multiple options here. I left it free and open-ended so that we could just calculate it ourselves. So the change in population of wolves from 2001 to 2003. Again, this is where students are oftentimes going to make mistakes because they're looking at the wrong axis. So wolves, in 2001, we have approximately 16 wolves. In 2003, we have approximately maybe 18 wolves. So I would say the change in wolf population is 2, right? The elk population change between then, and again, this is where students oftentimes make mistakes, is going to be from about 60 to about 40. So I would say -20 there. And make sure you use your positives and negatives because obviously a population change of 20 and a population of -20 is vastly different in this instance. Okay? So then we can do a little math here. Assuming that there is 0 immigration and emigration from 2001 to 2003, if 1 wolf died in that time, how many wolves were born? Okay, so again, you don't even need to look at the formula here. We can just logic our way through it. So if our change in population is equal to births minus death, and our change was 2, 2 is going to equal the number of births minus 1. Okay, so we must have had 3 births then because we had 1 wolf die and we still had a net gain of 2 wolves. Okay, so kind of just an easy example of some application here of these kinds of questions that are very straightforward. Something that you can look forward to. Sometimes they'll have passages regarding these things and you'll just have to answer some multiple choice questions and talk about how these relationships are affecting one another. So predator-prey graphs are always going to face one another. Okay, so I kind of show that, I'll show that on the next slide. It's important to know the difference between these 2 terms. So we'll go through those, and then if we still have time and you guys want to do a carrying capacity problem, we can take a look. Let me just plug my computer in. Okay. All right, so a density-dependent population change is going to be a factor that's going to change our population depending on how large our population is. So things like predators, inter and intra-specific competition, the accumulation of waste, disease, and parasites, a lot of the things that you told me can affect a population are going to be density dependent. It depends on how large our population is. The larger the population, the more diseases there are. The larger the population, the more accumulation of waste, the more competition, oftentimes the more predation, right? And so you can see here, this is pretty interesting. So we have our prey, right? And we have these like two curves that are essentially the same between the predator and the prey. They're just kind of chasing one another, right? So when prey numbers are really, really high, predator numbers are usually slightly lower, but then because there's lots of prey, those numbers start to increase. And then because there's lots of predators, the prey numbers decrease and the cycle continues, right? So they really exist dependent on one another. So density dependent population change, I've seen this come up in like a free response. You just need to be able to think logically, okay, the density means how many organisms we have. It's dependent on that. So things like predation, food supply, etc., would be examples of density dependent population change, as opposed to density independent population change, which is mainly abiotic factors like weather, temperature, rainfall, fire, natural disasters, and human activity. So you can think about like global warming would be a density independent population change. It doesn't matter how many organisms are in the population, they're still going to be affected by this change. Okay, so just kind of some vocab thrown in at the end there so that you understand why some of these changes that we're talking about have occurred. Okay, so we have a little time left, so I can show you what it looks like when, let me just pull it up, the millionth document. I can show you what it looks like when we have some sort of carrying capacity then, and this is going to change, so let me just get back a few slides so you can take a look at the equation. Our logistic growth equation. So instead of just being R max times N, now we have R max times N times K minus N divided by K. K is the carrying capacity. So it's the carrying capacity minus the population size divided by the carrying capacity. And so I'll do a practice problem here for you, and I may honestly just write it down on a piece of paper. I know it will be backwards for you guys, but I can audibly show you and you can be following along just because it'll take so much less time than me struggling through as I have been. So let me pull up the problem really quick, and I'll post it into these slides so that you guys can see it. And then we can just do a little practice. But again, if you can plug into a formula, if you can plug and chug, you are good to go with these problems because they're really never too challenging. Okay. So let me just snip this image really quick from my worksheet. And then we'll go through this problem. And then I can keep the problem up and you guys can be looking at it while I'm writing as opposed to having to split my screen. So we'll continue to go like this. And I'll just write on this little paper and you'll just have to deal with the process. Okay. Awesome. So in a meadow of 10,000 acres, there is a population of field mice. The population count for the first year was 4,000. So the first thing that I'm going to write down is N is equal to 4,000. Okay, for my first year. And it's estimated that the carrying capacity of the field for this population is 6,000 mice. So K is our carrying capacity, okay, and K is equal to 6,000. Okay, so if our mice get close to 6,000, their population growth should slow down similarly to how it does in this graphic. Okay, so we'll see an increased rate of growth followed by a slowing down rate until we're essentially not growing at all, approaching that carrying capacity. Okay. Our max is equal to 0.9, so we don't need to calculate it. They give it to us. So they've given us all of our variables. Now we just need to track growth over 5 years. Okay, so year one, our population size is 4,000. Okay, and in order to find our growth calculation, I don't know if you can see this piece of paper at all. Probably not. Let me see if I can turn off the light. That's not blaring, maybe. Okay, there we go. I'll just have to put it right up here. So our population is 4,000, and we want to see how much it's going to increase over the first year. Okay, so what we need to do is just plug and chug. So our R max is 0.09. So I'm using the formula. You can see it on the table right in front of you. So 0.9, not 0.09. 0.9 times N, our population size, which is 4,000. Okay, and then we're going to multiply that by our carrying capacity, which is 6,000 minus 4,000 divided by 6,000. Now, order of operations is important here because 6,000 minus 4,000 is 2,000 divided by 6,000 is going to give us a third, right? Which is very different than doing 1,000, the total number minus 6,000 divided by 6,000. The order of operations is essential here when you're plugging into your calculator, so be very careful. Okay. 2,000 divided by 6,000 times 4,000 times 0.9. Get an increase in population. So our change in population is equal to 1,200, 1,200. So hopefully you got that on your own working at home, because I'm not writing it all out for you at the speed of nothingness. So yes, great question. So the test gives you the exact formulas that I showed you on the formula sheet, and you can also click on the link that I sent out. So those equations are given to you, so you just need to be able to apply them. So the exact equations that I showed you on the slide are the exact things that are given to you on the AP exam. So you don't need to know what N or K is or R max. They'll tell you all that. Okay, perfect. So we have an increase of 1,200 mice in that first year. Okay, so our population at the end of year one is going to be 4,000 plus 1,200, or 5,200 mice. Okay, so now we need to restart. We have the same R max, but now we have a different N. Okay, so our change in N for year two, if you're following along, is going to be 0.9 times now 5,200 times 6,000, our carrying capacity stayed the same, minus 5,200 divided by 6,000. Okay, 800 divided by 6,000 times 5,200 times 0.9. And now we're only increasing by 624 mice. So our delta N for year two, if you're following along, is 624 mice, which is like half as many mice as we got in year one. So as you can see, we're already approaching this kind of slowdown of growth due to the fact that the mice are exceeding probably some sort of resource. Okay, so we started with 5,200. So now at the end of year two, we have 5,824 mice. Okay, so for year three, then we're starting with 5,824 mice. We have 0.9 times 5,824. We have 6,000 minus 5,824 divided by 6,000. Times 0.9. And now we only grew by 154 mice, right? So way smaller, like a quarter of the amount that we grew the year before, 154 mice. Okay, so now our population, 5,824 plus 154, is 5,978. I'm actually going to stop us there, because what you'll see is we'll just have very, very, very slow incremental growth after that, because we've approached our carrying capacity. So the mice do not have any more resources. They're not going to exceed the maximum amount. Although if you ask some ecologists, they will tell you that humans have already exceeded our carrying capacity of Earth, which you wouldn't think would be possible, but we've exhausted all of our resources. Some people think the carrying capacity of Earth is 10 billion. Some people think it's 9 billion. Some people think it's 7 billion, which means we've surpassed it. Truly depends on which ecologist you ask, but just kind of an interesting tidbit there. And don't worry, I'll tell you a lot more about how humans are ruining the planet in the weeks to come. Okay, so hopefully that helped a little bit. You got some vocab down, you got some math practice down, you got to see the world population clock and things like that. Next week, we'll talk more about community relations. I'm going to leave you with one of my favorite links because it talks about like what ecologists really get to do, what kind of research they get to do. So it's a link to something called OSearch, Ocean Research, and they tag sharks like on their dorsal fins, and then they track their behavior. So if you click on a certain shark, you can actually follow its pattern. Like this morning, I was looking with my class at a shark that went to the Bahamas in November, and I was like, well, I wish I went to the Bahamas in November. Like, this is a smart shark, right? But they can see like how they follow the patterns of water temperatures, where they hunt, their health, their weight, all sorts of cool things. So this is kind of like the job of the ecologist, is just to determine the health of different populations. So cool link to just check out in your free time, which you probably don't have very much, but still a cool link to check out. Next week, we'll talk more about community ecology, so come ready with questions for sure. I look forward to it. And I'm excited to talk to you guys then. Okay, so have a great week. Stay warm if it's still cold where you're at. Hopefully it's not. And I look forward to talking to you next Wednesday. Bye, guys. Have a great night.